Oh, I got that pretty good.
Hello and welcome to the build video of the Mighty Mini FW190. This plane is a swappable just like the Flight Test Mighty Mini series. However, unlike most swappables, this plane does involve a great deal of molding and custom trimming, and therefore I certainly don't recommend this to be one of your first foam board builds. The upside of the build is that it goes together very quickly and involves very few pieces, making it an ideal choice for scratch builders. The plane is very quick as well in the air due to its tapered airfoil, but for its size it's a very stable platform that tracks like an arrow. Go ahead and download the plans from the build article, and also take some time to check out the digital 3D model of the design that's embedded on the article as a reference for when you're building the plane. When you're cutting out the parts, make sure to align the grain direction on the plans with the grain direction of your foam board and poster board to make sure that pieces that are supposed to be curved on the design will mold easily and properly. One final thing to note is that this build video is going to be very fast-paced and is certainly not meant to be a build-along. Instead, I would recommend that you watch the video one time to understand the build, and then keep the video as a reference for when you're actually constructing the plane. With that said, go ahead and gather all your parts and tools on your work surface, and let's begin. Let's get started first with the internal structure of the fuselage. You're going to need the fuselage box former, the two power pod sleeves, the power pod itself, and the two formers labeled C. Also collect your build utensils such as a sanding block, a razor blade, barbecue skewer, and scrap pieces of foam. Let's begin with the power pod. Now this power pod is very similar to that of the Mini Mustang, except that it's going to be a lot shorter so that we can push the battery up for establishing the proper center of gravity on the airplane. Let's start off by making some A-folds of the side plate so that they line up above the bottom plate. We're going to place glue where the paper meets the foam, and while we're gluing the piece down with its A-fold, we're going to make sure that the side plate is perpendicular to the bottom plate, using a square, just like so. Make sure that you scrape off all the excess foam so that it doesn't get in the way of electronics, and so that it doesn't add excess weight to your build. And repeat the same process on the other side for the other side plate. Make note of the fact that at the front of your power pod, it'll have a little bit of a right angle, and that thrust angle is so that you can offset some inertial effects of the propeller that might make your airplane turn left. And so the thrust angle for this airplane is slightly over 4 degrees. When you glue the firewall to the power pod, make sure that it's aligning properly and that it's not leaking over one edge or the other. And also take time to remove excess glue so that the power pod can slide into the cowling eventually, unobstructed. And now, we have to remember that it's not the glue that holds the firewall to the power pod when your motor is pulling, hundreds, possibly thousands of grams of thrust. Instead, it's the packing tape. This is standard procedure for our Flight Test Minis, to use packing tape, or as Chad used to call it,
extreme packing tape.
That one's for the old-timers. What we're going to do is basically pass it over the firewall, and then tape it down to the side walls of the power pod and the bottom wall. And this is actually what holds on the firewall as your motor produces thrust and pulls the airplane along. One additional thing I like to do is, using the tape, I like to go over the top of the sidewalls, because this is where the paper usually likes to splay from the foam and basically make the power pod decay and get wrinkly and annoying over time as you pull it out and in of the airplane. Now let's move on to the fuselage box itself. First, we're going to start by deepening the score cuts and removing foam and paper where we need to, and these are marked by the cavities on the plans. Make sure that you don't cut through the entire piece while you're trying to widen the score cuts. Carefully remove the paper and the foam from the indicated areas on the plans, making sure that there's no foam left. Now the purpose of this paper is so that we can use it as bleed over to go over the top of the sidewall of the fuselage box and then leak over to the other side. What we don't want to do is have this paper sort of offset from the top of the fuselage. We want it lying down properly without any excess height. And so we're going to use a ruler to establish that sharp edge. And when we put glue down, we're going to put a very light bead on top of the sidewall and on the side of the top wall right here. Using the table as your friend, fold the side wall up onto the paper and also so that it meets the top wall, and remove excess glue as soon as possible. Another thing to do while you're establishing perpendicularity is to push the sidewall down onto your table. Like we said before, we don't want the paper sticking up from the sidewall. Now I'm coming back and adding a little bit of glue here to strengthen the joint and to reinforce the 90-degree angle. Once you've given the glue a good 30 seconds to harden, come back and fold the bleed over down onto the side wall of the fuselage, the inner wall. And go ahead and repeat the exact same process on the other side. Again, making very sure that the paper doesn't stick too far over the top of the sidewall. Now this is a little bit of a tight gap, but still try to remove as much excess glue as possible to save weight. Use your square to establish perpendicularity and check for angles whenever possible. Now we're going to move on to the front of this piece. The first thing we're going to do is fold the two side plates inward. Then we're going to establish the angles of the pieces using the fuselage box former. Note that the two side plates at the front are actually going to be parallel to each other instead of tapering outwards like the back. Just like so. Now on the step where we glue down the excess bleed over on the internal side wall, if you don't want to use glue, you can use tape. And note that I'm only putting the tape on the part of the paper that's going to sit inside the fuselage rather than on top, because I want to save as much thickness as possible, because that's where the hatch is going to sit down eventually. So now let's get started off with where the power pod is going to secure to this fuselage box. And that's going to be using the two power pod sleeves. The one for the top and the bottom are identical even though they're independently labeled on the plans. And these four walls are going to create basically a box that the fuselage can, that the power pod can slide into. I'm going to put glue on the two side plates right there, and on the two sides of the power pod sleeves. Immediately I'm going to remove as much excess glue as I need to, while simultaneously checking for perpendicularity, because I don't want the fuselage box to be slanted or deformed like a parallelogram. And this is very essential because the two power pod sleeves, along with the side walls of the fuselage, are going to provide basically a housing for the power pod, and therefore you don't want them angled in any way to alter the thrust angle of the motor. Go ahead and check for symmetry in the fuselage box to make sure that it's not warped or deformed in any certain way. Now, to make it easier to slide the power pod in, let's go ahead and bevel the inner walls of the fuselage box and of the power pod sleeves, just like so that it'll be a lot easier for the power pod to slide in the first time. If you've used tape, it's going to be especially difficult, but that's a good thing because the power pod will fit like a glove and it'll align in the right direction. An additional step that you can choose to do at this point is to basically reinforce the part where the barbecue skewer is going to be passing through the sidewalls of the fuselage and through the sidewalls of the power pod. This is very commonly the failure point of a lot of these Mighty Mini warbirds. At this point, if you want to, you can get rid of that fuselage box former by trimming the two tabs and cutting through them, thereby removing the piece. But you don't need to if you don't want to. You can also come back with some extra tape to bind the front and the back sections of the fuselage box. And this is going to provide a lot of extra strength for your plane, especially crash resistance. Now let's install the two fuselage formers labeled C. So the formers have a longer side and a shorter side, and the way to line them up, the best way to figure out which way to put them on, is to make sure that the former is flush with the top of the fuselage and leaks over the bottom. So let's put glue on the former and set it down on the sidewall of the fuselage. And one little nuance is that even though it's mated against the back part of the fuselage box, it should be perpendicular with the front plate. And this is going to help with forming the molds and the skins of the airplane later on. So use your square to establish the angle as you glue it in with the front of the fuselage rather than the back. And repeat the exact same process on the other side. Again, making sure that the top of the former lines up with the top of the fuselage box. I'm also putting glue on the inside to make sure that the tab sits in properly and the piece is properly secured, but it's not necessary if you don't want it. Remove as much excess glue as possible so that you're not adding weight to the build. The last thing we're going to do for these formers is to sand them so that they taper backwards just like the rest of the fuselage. And this is to allow the mold to sit down properly without leaking over or leaving an air gap at the front. So you can use a variety of utensils for this procedure. I prefer a sanding block, but sometimes it can be difficult when you're in a tight space. You can also save this step till you're adding the skin to see how much you need to taper the formers. So let's slide our power pod into place so that we don't lose it. And that is that for the front part of the fuselage. Alright, let's go ahead and get started with the rear fuselage. Make sure you have your horizontal stabilizer, vertical stabilizer plate, and formers D and E. On the elevator, you're going to see two score cuts. The inner one is for the control horn, and the outer one is for a torque rod that will bind the two elevators, which are currently split. Let's start off by doing the bevel cuts on the side of the elevators. It's going to be a little bit difficult to start from this side. We're going to start off with doing the bevels on the counterbalances right here. There are some beta builders that told me that you don't need to bevel the counterbalances. You can just go back with a push rod and make sure that they don't bind with the rest of the horizontal stabilizer, but I prefer to come back and make smooth bevels just to be safe, because the elevator is the most important control surface on your model airplane. Then we're going to come back and finish off the bevel cut on the two split elevators, and it's hard to do it in one continuous motion, so you might need to come back with a sander to make the bevel nice and smooth. On the other side, I'm going to flip my blade and come back with a jigsaw motion to finish off the bevel. Again, if you don't like what you see, you can always come back with a sanding block to make sure that the elevator has ample deflection. On the counterbalances, we can come back with a push rod and give a little bit of clearance so that the control surface doesn't bind with the horizontal stabilizer. Now let's form the torque rod that's going to bind the elevators together. Start by measuring out a little bit of the torque rod based on the size of the score cut that's provided, and make an L bend as shown here. And by inspection, just determine where the other bend needs to be on the opposite side so that it's just about symmetrically placed. Trim the other side to be symmetrical to the first one. And do a dry fit. Now make another score cut on the other side based on where the torque rod falls down. Go ahead and do a dry fit of the torque rod on the other side. And to press it into both sides, you might need to use something sharp like the tip of a pencil or a blade so that the torque rod sits down on both sides. And make sure that you have ample deflection. Now when we glue these, we're going to start and do one side at a time, but we have to work carefully and quickly. Put down one side, and as the glue's hardening, scrape off all the excess, especially the excess that leaks out onto the bevel where it might hinder deflection of the elevator, and then push the torque rod down onto the other side. you might need to use a blade to push it down just like we did during the dry fit. Also remove excess foam, and simultaneously make sure that the torque rod, isn't getting in the way of the elevator deflecting properly. You're going to need to balance these tasks together at the same time since the build is so small. Now go ahead and make sure that the elevator has ample deflection by cycling it back and forth. And if it doesn't, it might help to sand some more or to push the torque rod in so that it doesn't run into the other side of the horizontal stabilizer. Now, one trick that we can do to extend the lifetime of these airplanes is to put a little bit of glue on the hinge line and scrape off the excess, just to reinforce the hinge. You have to make sure of two things when you do this. Firstly, you have to make sure that the control surface doesn't get glued down by accident, and you also have to make sure that you don't put in too much glue such that the control surface can't deflect. Let's go ahead and repeat the same process on the vertical stabilizer, starting off with the bevel on the control surface and on the counterbalance. Now this is going to be a lot easier because the control surface isn't split, unlike the elevator. Notice that I'm coming back with my sanding block just to make sure that the bevel is nice and smooth to yield proper deflection. I'm also going to reinforce the joint with some hot glue and make sure to scrape off the excess so that I preserve deflection. Take your time on these steps even though the build video is moving rather quickly. Now to start the assembly, we're going to go ahead and pinch all of the tabs on the vertical stabilizer plate to make sure that parts fit in easier and quicker. Start off with fuselage former E and slide it down the slot that you see here. Instead of pulling this piece out and then putting glue back in, we're just going to leave the piece as is and put glue on the sides and use a scrap piece of foam to press it in where it needs to go. Repeat the same process with fuselage former D, except this time we'll need to be very careful to check for angles. So have a square ready to go. Now place glue on the front of the vertical stabilizer plate, above and below the tab, and glue it down to former D, making sure to scrape off all the excess foam and to check for perpendicularity. Now let's focus on putting the horizontal stabilizer into place. There's not much real estate to glue this thing down, so you're going to need to focus a lot of glue in the right spots. Put a little bit of glue on this opening right here, and make sure that you don't go too far back because the torque rod might run into hardened glue later on. The best way to avoid that is to make sure that as the glue is hardening, you make sure to deflect the elevator and see that it's not getting in the way of any glue or any foam. Make sure to check for your right angles, and also if you choose to reinforce the bottom with hot glue, scrape off all the excess to save weight. Now hold off on gluing the vertical stabilizer because we're not going to do that quite yet. But just to make sure that it doesn't get hurt, you can go ahead and fold it into place and tab it in, just as shown. Make sure one last time that the elevator and the rudder both have proper deflection. Now let's get started with the hatch. You're going to need the hatch plate, the hatch rear former, and the hatch roof. Let's start with the hatch plate. Crack open the two score cuts on the front and remove the paper and the foam where indicated on the plans. What we're going to do now is bevel the sides of the hatch plate. Go ahead and remove the paper on the sides where indicated and perform bevels on the exposed foam. The bevels are only going to go as deep as the paper that you removed. The paper removed not only makes it easier to do the bevel cut, but also provides a guide as to how deep the cut should be. Now on the other side, you're probably going to have to come back and do the jigsawing motion to finish the bevel cut. If it doesn't come out quite well, you can always come back with a sanding block. Now on the two rear bevels, they're probably too shallow to use a knife, so you can use something like a barbecue skewer or a sanding block or some sandpaper. Gluing on the rear hatch former is no special procedure. Just put glue on the hatch plate around this slot. And as you glue in the piece, check for right angles and make sure to remove all the excess glue that oozes out. Now for the front former, we're going to do a B-fold. And you'll see that the sides of the former actually line up with the bevel cuts that you made. It's very important that you do this as a B-fold and not an A-fold. We're going to place glue where paper meets the foam, and as we glue the piece in and remove excess foam, instead of establishing 90 degrees, we're actually going to press the piece a little bit past 90 degrees, just as shown. And this is because the line where the hatch meets the fuselage is an iconic line on the Focke-Wulf, and it's actually angled downwards a little bit with respect to the thrust line. Now let's get started with the hatch roof. Make sure that this piece is tapering towards the front, tapering outwards toward the front, just like the hatch plate, for proper orientation. Remove the paper on the two side cheeks and crack open the two score cuts. This time, we're going to be performing the bevels on the side where the paper is still attached. It's going to be slightly more difficult, but nothing you haven't done before on the control surfaces. You don't need to make the cut too deep, just so that you're able to get about 45 degrees of deflection on the side plates. Now, what we're going to do is mold the areas where the paper is removed, but only towards the front of the hatch roof piece, just as shown. And you can always use something like a ruler as a second flat surface in addition to the table, so that you don't use your fingers and end up wrinkling the piece. You don't have to mold the back of the piece, because as you can see, the rear hatch former is actually linear. It doesn't have a curve. Try to center the skin as best as you can, and make the two side cheeks follow the shape of the formers, just as shown. And the piece should sit down without any trouble. We're going to hold off on doing this all in one go, and instead we're just going to glue down the top of the hatch roof onto the top of the two formers. But just to make sure that everything's lined up properly, do a dry mold as you glue this down to make sure that the side cheeks are sitting properly on the formers and on the bevel cuts. With a scrap piece of foam handy, we're going to finish gluing the hatch roof down onto the hatch plate. Place glue on one side of the two formers and on the corresponding bevel cut. As you mold this piece into place, you're going to want to take it maybe to the edge of the table or your building platform, because the rear part of the hatch plate may not like having to sit down on the table. It actually protrudes out just a little bit more than the thickness of foam available. Or you can just use a ruler if you want to do this operation in your hand. Make sure to remove as much excess glue as you can, because we're going to have to trim this piece into place and we don't want glue in the way when we do that. Now, as we're trimming, the easiest way to do this and to make sure that you get the proper result, you should use the bottom of the hatch plate as a railing for your blade to follow along as it cuts and trims the excess. Do multiple passes, first 2 times probably through the foam, and then the third and final time through the paper, and that should ensure that you get a nice cut. But if you don't like what comes out, you can always come back with a sanding block to smoothen out the edge. And, if you don't use the bottom of the hatch plate as a railing and you instead angle the blade where you try to come in from the other side, you might end up removing more foam than you need to. And that's going to be a bad thing, because that's going to leave an air gap between the hatch and the fuselage where it sits down. Now all I'm doing here is repeating the exact same process on the other side, making sure to trim the hatch roof flush with the bottom of the hatch plate. If you didn't remove all the glue you could, your knife is probably going to have to go through glue and that'll make this take a longer while than it needs to. We're probably going to have to come back and trim the hatch more later on so that it sits down properly on the fuselage to custom fit your airframe, but that's for later. Another trick I like doing is coming back with a hot glue gun just to heat up the edges of the paper and sort of heat press the paper onto the foam, just like the foam board is manufactured. It's manufactured by heat rolling rather than gluing the paper to the foam. And that's it for our hatch. Let's get started with the cowling. You're going to need the cowling formers A and B, and make sure you take the fuselage box as well. Start with the bigger one, former B, and make sure that the score cut on the former is at the top. One thing you can do to make it easier to slide on former A is to bevel the outsides of the power pod sleeves and the fuselage box side walls, just like we did for the insides when we were sliding in the power pod. You'll see that former A can slide nicely against the front walls of the fuselage box. Now, the cowling is going to be ideally removable, but we don't want former B moving around while we're trying to mold the cowling into place. Because of that, you're going to want to use some sort of weak glue, like white glue or stick glue, to secure former B to the fronts of former C. Now, if you use hot glue, you risk not being able to remove the cowling later on, which is very inconvenient when you want to repair just the front of your plane after a crash. We're going to go ahead and remove the paper off of cowling mold C with one of many different ways. You can go over the edge of the table, just use your fingers as shown here, or use two flat surfaces like the table and a ruler. And the ruler method is especially useful when you want to add curvature near the ends of the piece. Now, the ends of the piece mathematically still have the same radius of curvature as the middle, but it's much harder to bend them because you can't establish a nice moment around them like you can around the center. Once you're confident that the mold can actually meet itself edge to edge, line up the two score cuts in the middle of the mold with the score cuts on the tops of formers A and B. Make sure that the cowling tapers inward towards the front. Now we're going to start off by molding this piece from top to bottom. Place glue on the tops of the formers and put down the mold, again making sure to align score cut with score cut. It might be difficult, but you can find the score cuts even after you glue the piece down by looking at the mold from the front and the back, because the score cut will have gone deeply into the foam board. While you're gluing this piece down, you might want to do a dry mold of the piece around the cowling formers, just to make sure that it follows the formers and doesn't leak off to one side or another. In terms of gluing this piece down, we're going to go one side at a time. Keeping a scrap piece of foam ready, place a bead of glue on only one side of the two formers and mold the piece into place, removing all the excess foam, especially that which leaks out the back. And when you're putting glue on the back former B, make sure that the glue doesn't leak onto former C, again, thereby binding the cowling to the fuselage permanently. Now, when you mold the other side down, you're going to see that there's going to be a little bit of leakage. The reason for this has to do with differences in cutting. If I had designed this piece so that it perfectly meets end to end the way I cut it, either by hand cutting or by laser cutting, it might not match because of the way you cut it. And because of that, I chose to err on the positive side and let everyone trim the piece as necessary. So look at the mold from the front and the back, and make little cuts, make little score cuts to tell yourself how deeply to trim the piece, thereby leaving a little bit of bleed over, just like seen here. This is especially useful if you accidentally leave a gap in the middle and you need to cover it up. I'm going to place glue on the two formers as well as the exposed edge of the mold so that the piece meets itself nicely, just like this. Make sure to remove all the excess glue and also make certain that the mold follows the shape of the formers. As a final step, use your glue of choice to glue down the bleed over if you have any. Now's the part where you can actually remove the cowling from the fuselage if you glued it down with a weak glue like white glue or stick glue. Now you can see that I made a big mistake using hot glue and I'm having to yank this thing off, and it's pulling paper off of former C, and it's very messy. But at this point, your cowling should fit like a glove over the fuselage box, and we're ready to move on to molds A and B of the cowling. These are going to be a little bit difficult because they're small, so take your time on them to make sure that you don't end up wrinkling the pieces. Remove the paper from mold B and perform a bevel on the outer side. Now you can do this the way John Overstreet does it, coming from the inside like this. I prefer to come in from the outside using a blade and using my left hand to feed the piece into the blade, performing the same jigsawing motion with the blade so that I don't have to pull the blade around the piece. Now, of course, if this is your first time with a build this small or this, so to say, advanced, you might need to come back with a sander to make sure that you remove enough foam from the piece and that the bevel is nice and continuous. Molding this piece should be very easy because you have barely any foam to work with, but still make sure that you don't get any wrinkles. A piece this small is going to go with the grain on certain places, but towards the ends it might actually go against the grain because it has such a tight radius of curvature. So it might be uncharacteristically difficult to mold in certain places, and easier to mold near the center, for example. As far as gluing this piece in, we're going to work on 1/4 of the piece at a time. Now for mold B, unlike mold C, we're going to actually start from the bottom and work our way around the top all the way back to the bottom. Place glue on the exposed edge of the front of mold C, and make sure that the seams between molds B and C actually line up as you're gluing the piece down. Other than watching for the seams to be matched, you also need to make sure that you remove excess glue on the inside because you're adding dead weight onto the airframe. Do the same thing for the second quarter of the piece, making sure that the seams line up and that you're removing excess glue. And repeat for the third and fourth quarters. As we had to do with mold C, you might need to do a little bit of trimming to mold B to get the two edges to meet properly. And now you're going to repeat the exact same process for mold A. It's just the bevel might be a little bit harder and the molding might be a little bit more difficult because, as mentioned before, parts of this piece are going against the grain and parts of it are going with the grain. You can see that I'm using my left hand to move the piece while my right hand does the exact same motion with the blade. I'm using my fingers to mold this piece into place. It's very hard to use a table, in my opinion, for a piece this small, so I prefer to use my fingers. You can see that the foam is actually wrinkling in certain places and not in others, and this is because of the grain issue. Just like we did for mold B, we're going to start from the bottom for mold A and work our way to the top and back down, going 1/4 at a time with our glue gun. It's important to make sure that the seams line up so that your plane looks good, but also to make sure that you remove glue on the inside to save on weight. Now I got lucky with mold A and I didn't have to trim my piece, and I'm hoping that most of you will get the same luck, or hopefully we'll just have to trim a little bit so that the piece fits into place properly. Now at the end, I'm just going to come back with the heat of the nozzle of my hot glue gun, just to make sure that I melt any of the glue that's sticking out outside of the seams. And now the cowling is complete and ready to go. go ahead and slide it back onto the fuselage. It's also important to make sure that the power pod can still pass through the cowling without running into the two molds that we just glued in on the front. And that's it for the cowl. Now let's get started on my favorite part, the molded wings. We're going to go ahead and remove paper in 4 areas now. The top surface right here, where the airfoil is going to be molded. And the areas back here, where the airfoil is going to taper so that its trailing edge is the thickness of 1 foam board rather than 2. Before we do anything, let's go ahead and remove the 2 slots here that are meant for the tabs on the wing spars. Now, if you're really good, you might be able to remove all the paper and foam here in one go. Otherwise, you might have to deepen the score cuts a little bit so that it comes out properly. Note that I'm using the back of my knife here to avoid tearing through the paper on the other side. If it all doesn't come out in one go, you can always nibble at the foam with your X-Acto knife. Notice that no paper has been removed on the other side. To taper the trailing edge, we're going to need a crafting knife with a nice handle, as well as a sanding block to smooth the bevel after it's done. Now it's very hard to freehand this, so we're going to use a raised platform and a ruler. The 2 main objectives are to make sure that the paper at the trailing edge doesn't get ripped, and that the bevel only extends as far as the paper that's been removed. We're going to meet the first objective by using a raised platform and lining up the trailing edge of the wing with the edge of that platform. And we're going to meet the second objective by using a ruler slightly ahead of the paper that we just removed. So you can see that the first cut isn't going to come out perfect, and you're not going to be able to make the perfect, planar bevel on the first go. But that's what the sanding block is for. Your main objective on the first try is to establish the general shape of the bevel, and to make sure that the knife doesn't drag through the paper at the back, causing any tears. Now, if the paper on the trailing edge does tear off, it's not really the end of the world, because the trailing edge of the top surface of the wing is going to meet it, and it's not going to be very visible from a distance. You can see that the bevel has actually come off in one piece, which is a very good thing. And now I'm ready to come back and fine-tune the bevel with my sanding block. The shape of the bevel should be such that it forms a line at every point between the edge of the paper that was removed and the trailing edge of the wing, so that the top surface of the wing will be able to sit down properly when we do the mold over. Take your time on these steps to make sure that everything comes out nice and smooth. It looks like I did everything right this time because the paper at the back has not been torn into. Go ahead and repeat the exact same process on the other side, making sure that the bevel is nice and smooth and continuous. Now let's go ahead and work on the leading edge bevels. Now, unlike the elevator, there are no counterbalances and interruptions, so you can go ahead and complete the entire bevel on one surface in one go. If it doesn't come out right the first time, you can always come back with a sanding block like we've done. Now, when you perform the bevel on the side where the paper has been removed, you might have to start the bevel by making a little bit of a cut where the undercambered portion of the wing ends. And the same thing on the other side, you don't need to really extend the bevel the whole way. Now let's go ahead and start crushing this bevel down to help us form the wing. Press it down a little bit, let it come back up, and then press it back down, and do this multiple times. Before we go any further, let's work on the spar. Crack open the score cut in the middle, and bind the two sides of the spar together with a little bit of glue on the inside, so that your spar has an effective thickness of 2 sheets of foam board. Scrape off all the excess and fit it onto the surface of the wing. Now you'll see that part of the spar actually hangs over the square cut meant for the servo, and make sure that when you're putting glue on the spar, you avoid that portion so that you don't waste glue, and also so that glue doesn't droop onto your building surface by accident. After giving this a good 10-15 seconds to harden, go ahead and trim off the portion of the spar that's hanging over the square cut for the servo. The two spars are identical, so it doesn't matter which you use for which side. You might have to deepen the score cut with a knife so that you don't tear a bit of the spar when you're trying to crack the score cut apart. Use minimal glue on the inside because you really don't need to add much strength on this piece. It just needs to stay together as you're forming the wing. Make sure that the spar sits up against the surface of the wing and that the glue doesn't give it any extra thickness. Now let's work on the most gratifying part, which is actually molding the surface of the airfoil. For this part, since the piece is so big, I can actually use my fingers and without worrying about wrinkling the piece. You want to concentrate most of the curvature near the leading edge, where the airfoil is going to curve, and not towards the back where it's going to transition to being more linear. Another thing you want to note is that you don't want to mess with the score cut where the molded part of the wing meets the linear part at the back. You can see that I'm molding it over gently so that I don't mess with the crease at the back. And if you did everything properly, the trailing edges should match very well. We're going to put a bead of glue on the leading edge of the wing, on the spar, and on the trailing edge. So we're going to put a bead at the front of the area where the paper was removed, at the back, and one in the middle. You can see that I'm going easy on the glue, but trying to maintain a straight line wherever possible. And try to keep the glue a little bit offset from the trailing edge so that you don't have to squeegee off too much, because you should be putting your attention to holding the airfoil down. As you mold the airfoil over, make sure that it sits mated with the top of the spar without leaving any gaps, and that you remove any excess glue off the trailing edge as soon as possible, and then focus on holding the wing down as it forms its shape. I'm also using a ruler at the back so that I can apply even pressure throughout the wing. If you need to come back and melt some of the glue on the trailing edge, or you see that there wasn't enough and you need to add more, that's perfectly fine. I'm just squeegeeing the glue, pressing it into the space where it needs to be. Let's go ahead and repeat the exact same process on the other side. Gently molding the wing, taking our time, doing multiple dry moldovers, and then working on gluing everything in. We're going to put glue on the leading edge, on the two pieces of the spar, and 3 gentle beads on the back. Just like Josh shows on the build video for the Mini Mustang, it might be a good idea to actually put a weight on top of the wing, a gentle weight, but good enough to hold the wing down as the moldover, as the hot glue dries, so that the moldover will keep its shape and won't pop open over time. In this case, I'm just going to hold it down for at least 2 or 3 minutes with the ruler. And again, I'm coming back with a little bit of extra glue if I missed any spots on the trailing edge. Now let's work on actually cutting out the ailerons themselves. You can see that there are cutouts inboard as well as at the tip. The first thing we need to do is extend these cuts all the way down to the bottom surface of the wing from where they start on the top. The next thing we're going to do is connect the dots on the bottom, thereby trying to establish the hinge line for the aileron. You're going to need to do this with multiple passes, especially if you accidentally put glue in the wrong area, because you might have to cut through glue then, effectively. I'm using a sort of a jigsawing motion so that I can gently cut through the glue and paper, the glue and the foam in the middle. After that's done, come back with a nice strong knife, preferably a craft knife with a handle, to form the bevel. Now the bevel doesn't need to be too deep, but since it goes through about more than one layer of foam, you're going to need to use a nice strong knife for this, to make sure that the cut comes out continuously. You don't need much aileron deflection for good roll authority on this model, but do try to make sure that the bevel is even and smooth without any areas where there's bumps of hot glue or foam. If you so wish, you can extend the bevel cut to the very tip on the curved portion. I'm coming back with a sanding block just to make sure that the bevel is nice and smooth. Come back with a push rod or an X-Acto knife just to increase the clearance on the two side cuts so that the aileron doesn't bind with the rest of the wing as it deflects. And now we're going to do the exact same process on the other side. Even though it looks sped up on this video, make sure that you take your time on these steps, especially the step where you have to jog your knife through the hinge line cutout. Because if you try to crack open the hinge too early, you might open it up at the wrong spot, and you might actually wrinkle the top surface of the wing, which I've done on the first prototype, and it doesn't look very good. On the aileron for the left wing, you're going to have to do the very annoying procedure where you start from halfway of the aileron, and then you have to use sort of a jigsawing motion to work your way to the other side. These are some of the many steps that make this build a little bit more challenging than something like, say, a Mighty Mini Sportster. I'm going to go ahead and do the hinge strengthening trick by putting a little bead of hot glue and scraping off the excess, and squeegeeing the glue into the hinge line where the paper meets the foam. And this is going to increase the lifetime of the build and the control surfaces. Before we try to glue together the wing halves and form the dihedral angle, it might be a good idea to install the aileron servos because you still have access to the inside of the airfoil from the center. The one thing different about this dihedral gauge is that it does not sit at the tip of the wing. It actually sits at the lip underneath, where the undercambered portion begins. I'm going to go ahead and put some glue on the inside of the airfoil on one side, as well as on the spar. And once I press the wing halves together, I'm going to put the dihedral gauge in place, and I'm going to focus my effort on holding the two wing halves together. It might even help to put a weight on one side while the glue hardens. Give this a good 30 seconds to 1 minute before you start tampering with it. I'm going to come back with one more bead of glue on the top, just to press glue into the crease to give the wing a lot more positive G-strength. You're going to need to use a lot of tape on the top surface to make sure that the wing also has good negative G-strength if you want to fly inverted and do other maneuvers like 4-point rolls and stuff like that. The good thing about this build is that since the wing forms as one piece, you don't need to put tape at the bottom, and that's especially good for a low wing because you see the bottom of the wing in flight, and it's good not to have tape there for aesthetic purposes, and also for purposes of painting. After the wing has settled down and the glue has hardened, make sure that the wing has good positive and negative G-strength. The very last step associated with assembling the wing is to cover the undercambered portions because there's exposed foam there. Now this is not a very necessary step, but it does help if, especially if you're going to be landing on wet grass, or you're going to be landing on gravel or any sort of rough, uneven surfaces. Because if you land and your wings aren't perfectly level, there's a chance that this undercambered portion of exposed foam can contact pebbles or wet surfaces and slowly decay over time. I'm going to go ahead and use some Scotch stick glue to glue on the extra paper pieces. Or you can actually come in with a can of spray glue and spray the paper and then stick it to the undercambered portion. The most important thing is to make sure that you press the paper onto the foam at the edges to prevent delamination over time. Trim off the excess and repeat the exact same process on the other side. The last thing I'm going to do is press down the sides of the paper where it meets the foam, again to make sure that it can't catch anything and try to rip off during flights or landings or even handling during transport. And that's it for the construction of the wing. Alright, let's get started with molding the fuselage. The first thing we're going to do is go ahead and remove the two tabs in the middle. Remember that you're only removing the paper and the foam. And if it doesn't come out right away, try to go back with your X-Acto knife and deepen the score cuts without cutting through the paper. The next thing we're going to do is try to do a little bit of a light indent on these two edges after cracking open the score cut. If you have scratch built and the foam is refusing to indent, you can come back with a knife, but try not to make the cuts too deep because all you need is a very, very slight bend. And you should see that the other side starts to bend, forming a crease. If it can bend about 10 degrees off the ground, that's all you need. Now let's go ahead and crack open the other two score cuts. This time we're going to be performing 45-degree bevels on the insides. Over here and over here. You can always come back with a sander if the cut doesn't come out smooth the first time. Now let's go ahead and remove the paper on the two marked areas. Do this carefully and slowly so that you can remove it all in one go and not have to come back in. Now before we start molding this piece, since it's so slender and thin, it's very hard for us to apply a moment around it. And so we're going to pre-treat it by rolling something like a dowel or a marker over the top, thereby slightly compressing the foam on top and allowing it to accept a radius of curvature in just a bit. Remember that the piece is going to be more rounded towards the front where it meets fuselage former C, versus at the back where it meets the flat sides of the vertical stabilizer. Now, to help us with molding, we're going to go ahead and use the same trick we did before for the hatch, where we used a ruler as the second flat surface additional to the table. You can see that I'm working my way from the bottom to the top, keeping my hands on the ruler and pressing the fuselage against the table so that I can prevent any wrinkling that might happen if my fingers contacted the surface instead. The ruler is especially useful near the edges. About 15 seconds of firm molding is going to give us a good curve near the front. The curve near the back needs to be less accentuated, so don't put as much pressure while you're molding the back. Do make sure though to focus a lot of your molding towards the edges, right there. Once the mold is starting to establish a nice curve, the next thing we're going to do is fold up the side cheeks just like this, just like we would on the wing, and try to press it onto the other side, thereby crushing the bevel. Now, let's go and fit the vertical stabilizer plate onto the fuselage mold, pressing the two tabs into the two slots. The bottom of the fuselage should take the shape of the bottom of the formers, and the side wall should come up against the sides of fuselage formers D and E. One thing you might need to do, because of the tolerances associated with cutting methods, is to sand the back of the fuselage where it meets the underside of the horizontal stabilizer. Go ahead and repeat the exact same molding procedure on the other side. And even though this looks like it's going very quickly on the video, do take your time on the molding to make sure that the piece holds its own shape without you having to hold it. You can see that I'm focusing the pressure of my ruler especially near the ends, where it's difficult to mold the piece. Again, we're going to fold the side cheek up and try to press it all the way down to the other side to help it hold shape while it sits against the fuselage, because we don't want this mold fighting us when we glue it onto the fuselage internals. It might take a few iterations of going back and forth between fitting it to the vertical stabilizer plate and then remolding it and then going back and forth. You can see that both sides of the fuselage mold now wrap around properly, meeting the nooks on former D and E, as well as the underside of the horizontal stabilizer. Also make sure that the bottom of the fuselage is angling properly with respect to the bottoms of fuselage formers D and E. We're going to go ahead and place glue now on the bottom of the vertical stabilizer plate, as well as the two formers D and E. Make sure to align the two slots in the proper spot, and also make sure that the bottom plates of the fuselage mold are bending up properly at the correct angle before you hold the piece in place to let the glue harden. Just to make sure that everything's symmetrical, go ahead and do a dry mold of the fuselage around the sides as the glue is hardening. Now we're going to go ahead and work on one side of the fuselage at a time. Crack open the score cut on one side and place glue on the sides of formers D and E, as well as the back of the mold where it wraps to the vertical stabilizer, as well as where it meets the horizontal stabilizer. Right there and right there. Note that on the back, the mold actually presses up against the vertical stabilizer, and the curve at the front of the mold transitions to a line at the back. Again, make sure that when you're holding this piece in place, do a dry mold of the other side as well. Repeat this process on both sides. And that brings the construction of our fuselage mold to an end. And make sure to leave the vertical stabilizer unglued at this point. Now, let's move on to assemble all the parts that we've built so far. Starting by joining the fuselage box and the wings. Begin by pinching the tabs on the bottoms of the fuselage box and press them into the corresponding slots on the wing, and try to press the box as far forward inside the slot as possible. The next thing we're going to do is trim the leading edge of the wing to be flush with the fronts of the former fuselage former C, both of them. And to do that, I'm going to start off by holding my blade flush with the formers and just making a little mark on each side of the leading edge, just like that. Then, just visually, I'm going to establish a line in my head between those two marks and connect the dots and gradually work my way through it with a knife. And our goal is to trim the leading edge of the wing such that the cowling can sit mated against that trimmed edge. So what I'm doing now is just pressing my blade into that imaginary line that I established, connecting the two dots. And since we're cutting through multiple layers of paper and foam and possibly glue, make sure you make multiple passes with your blade until you're finally ready to cut the entire piece off. And if you're not happy with the trimmed edge, you can always come back and smooth the surface with a sanding block. So now when you fit the wing onto the fuselage box, the trimmed edge should be flush with the front of former C, and the cowling should be able to sit up, mated with the trimmed edge. Now, we're going to repeat the exact same process on the trailing edge of the wing, so that the rear fuselage will be able to sit up, mated against the trailing edge once it's trimmed. This time it should be easier since we're not cutting through any glue, and I can always come back and smoothen the surface with a sanding block. I'm going to be putting 4 beads of glue on the bottom of the fuselage, from fuselage former C all the way to the back of the fuselage box, just like that. And when I hold this down, I'm going to remember to pull the piece as far forward as I can inside the play of the slot, and also to make sure that the piece is sitting symmetrically by looking at the wing from the top and from the front. Make sure to give this a good 30 seconds to harden while holding the fuselage box down onto the wing. One last time, press fit the cowling on and make sure that everything's sitting properly. And if it doesn't, you can always come back and further trim the leading edge of the wing so that it does. And now we're ready to join the rear fuselage with the current assembly. The fit is going to be rather simple on this. The 2 slots on the front of fuselage former D are going to slide onto the tabs at the back of the fuselage box, and the bottom of the fuselage mold is going to line up against the trimmed trailing edge of the wing. Take your time in fitting this piece, and make sure that once the piece fits, the front of the fuselage mold lines up with the front of fuselage former C. I'm going to place glue at the back of the fuselage box, as well as on the trimmed portion of the trailing edge of the wing. And then I'm going to press the fuselage on and hold it in place, making sure that former D is pressed up tightly against the back of the fuselage box. Flip the assembly over and make sure that there's no glue oozing out the bottom, and if there is, press it back in with your scrap piece of foam and remove the excess. And now, we're going to finish gluing the fuselage onto the rest of the assembly. To start, I'm going to place glue on the sides of former C on one side, and also on the edge of the fuselage box right here. I'm going to try to make sure that most of the glue stays on the edge, on the side of the edge, rather than on the top. And keep a scrap piece of foam handy so that if any glue does ooze out the top, you can remove it immediately. So to recap, glue on the side of fuselage former C, and on the edge of the fuselage box as far back as you can go, comfortably with the nozzle of your glue gun, and making sure that most of the glue slides down onto the side of the fuselage wall, rather than oozing out onto the top. I'm coming back with my scrap and removing as much glue as I can quickly. As the glue hardens, make sure that you hold the mold against the side of the fuselage box, just like this. And also scrape off all the excess glue that may have oozed out at the front of fuselage former C. And now we're going to repeat the exact same process on the other side. The reason why we wanted to remove as much glue as possible from the top is that we're actually going to trim the top of the fuselage mold to be flush with the top of the fuselage box, similar to what we did on the hatch a little while ago. With regards to trimming this piece, what we want to do is establish a nice linear cut from the back to the front of the fuselage mold, and the best way to do this is to make two marks on either side. So start at the back and push your knife through, making sure that the knife is going to be flush with the top of the fuselage box, and then do the same at the front. And if you want, you can actually connect those 2 dots either using a ruler and a pencil, or you can run your knife along with the ruler and make a score cut to be a guide for the blade when you do the trimming. There are multiple ways to do this. I'm just going to try to freehand it and see how it comes out. freehand used in a loose way because I still have the fuselage box on the inside to use as a guide for the blade. And the most important part of this, just like on the hatch, is to make sure that the blade is angled flat with the top of the fuselage box as you're doing the cut. On the parts where you may have left a little bit of glue, the blade might find it hard to pass, so you might need to use a jigsawing motion to go back and forth and to make the cut easier. It's always good to err on the positive side, meaning leaving more than you need so that you can come back and trim it. I'm going to repeat the exact same process on the other side, again starting by making a mark at the front, a mark at the back, and then connecting the two, either with a ruler and a pencil or with a score cut, and then passing the blade along that line so that the top of the fuselage mold is trimmed to be flush with the top of the fuselage box. And this is the end result so far. The next thing we're going to do is to glue the side of the fuselage mold onto the wing surface so that it's not flapping around, or that it isn't deformed during a crash, or even when you're hand launching the airplane if you like to hold it in an overhand fashion. Use this scrap piece of foam to press the glue into the seam and also to remove the excess that squeezes out. And the main assembly of our fuselage is coming to an end. Slide the cowling back on and make sure that the front of the fuselage mold is now sitting up against the cowling, the back of the cowling. And now let's worry about joining the hatch and the fuselage. Sand the bottom of the hatch and the top of the fuselage so that the hatch is sitting up to the proper level with respect to the cowling. Now I had to spend close to 3 to 5 minutes on the second prototype when I knew what I was doing to make sure that everything sat down just like this, leaving only maybe 1 to 2 millimeters of offset at the front. And that's it for the assembly of the fuselage. Let's put our attention now to the posterboard pieces, namely the turtle deck that's going to go on the back, the canopy up front, and the wing fairings. Let's start with the turtle deck. We're going to have to mold this the same way we molded the fuselage piece, except the process might be slightly different because it's posterboard. I'm still going to use the ruler to establish a nice tight radius of curvature at the ends, and I'm going to use either the edge of a table or something like a marker to mold the main body of the turtle deck. You're going to want this holding its own shape before you try to glue it to the fuselage so that it's not fighting you when you're trying to glue it down, or that it doesn't pop up once you let it go. Once you're confident that the piece holds its own shape, let's do a dry fit on the fuselage. The 2 tabs at the back go below the horizontal stabilizer, and the 2 sharp teeth that you can see there go above the top of the horizontal stabilizer. And the front wraps to the top of fuselage former D. And make sure that everything's centered up front. One thing you could do is put hot glue on the side of the turtle deck, just like we usually do on Mighty Mini warbirds. But something I like to do is just use spray glue on these pieces because it induces less of an offset between the posterboard and the foam board. So I've put my spray glue on the turtle deck, and then I'm going to put a bead of hot glue on the top of fuselage former D. I don't really need glue elsewhere on the back, such as on the vertical stabilizer plate or on the top of fuselage former E, because that's just going to add unnecessary weight. Then wrap the turtle deck around the 2 formers onto the sides of the fuselage mold, and make sure that it's sitting down onto the fuselage at all locations, including underneath the horizontal stabilizer at the back. And then we're ready to finally glue in the vertical stabilizer. You can put glue on top of the horizontal stabilizer, on top of the tab that's sticking out right there, and into the slot. You can also place a little bead of glue on top of the turtle deck where the vertical stabilizer is going to leak. right there. Now this alone is not going to hold the vertical stabilizer in place very well. You'll see that it can wiggle around a lot. So we're going to come back with more glue, but before that, let's make sure that the vertical stabilizer and horizontal stabilizer are perpendicular. It's also a good idea at this point to make sure that all the surfaces, the horizontal stabilizer, the vertical stabilizer, and the wing are forming the proper angles by looking at the airplane from the top and from the front, and adjusting things as needed. So as mentioned, I'm going to put additional glue between the vertical and horizontal stabilizer, press the glue into the seam, and remove the excess. You should see now that the vertical stabilizer has much less wiggle and play. Now comes probably the toughest part of the build, which is forming and gluing in the canopy. The first thing we're going to do is establish the crease lines on the canopy that are provided on the plans that mark the windows. There's one on each side. I'm using the back of my knife to establish these creases to make sure that I don't cut through the poster board, and then I can use the edge of my ruler to help establish the sharp crease exactly where it needs to be. Now the first thing I'm going to mold is this area right here, between the front window and the main body of the canopy. For this portion, it's sufficient to just use your fingers and gently mold it into a nice arc. With regards to the back of the canopy, it's still a slender piece, so you're going to have to use the ruler at the ends and be very careful that you don't make any wrinkles while you're trying to mold the piece into shape. Take your time on this piece because you really need to make sure that the canopy holds its own shape before you try to glue it down to the fuselage, or you might observe that it starts popping off on its own, especially near the back. This is one of those pieces where you have to mold it and then let it sit for a bit and then mold it again and again and again to make sure that it's holding the proper shape. Before we try to do any more work, let's tape the windows together so that the canopy starts to take its shape. I like to use tape rather than tabs that are built into the poster board to make sure that all the windows are flush with each other where they meet, rather than overlapping and sitting on top of each other, which might look a little bit off for a build this small. I'm basically using the tape to bind all 4 of the edges that are involved, including the 2 at the back right here. And if you're doubtful whether the tape is going to hold the canopy together over time, you can always come back and put a little bit of glue on the top of the seams and then remove the excess with a scrap piece of foam. I'm really going easy on the glue here and making sure that it melts well onto the region without leaving any thick residues. You can see that I'm using the heat of my nozzle to melt any of the glue that remains hardened. So now comes the tough part, which is gluing the canopy onto the hatch. The first thing you want to do is to make sure that the hatch doesn't move around while you're gluing the canopy on. And to do that, the best thing to do is actually come in with a piece of masking tape and secure the front of the hatch to the fuselage. And you'll notice that there's really nothing to hold the canopy in place at the back, and it's actually popping off from the turtle deck, which is not a good thing. If you see that happening, come back and do a little bit more of pre-molding on the canopy before you try to glue it down. You can see that after about 15 to 30 more seconds of molding, the piece is actually starting to hold its shape and hug the turtle deck at the back. And once you're confident that the canopy is sitting symmetrically and in the right place, make a little mark with a pencil at the front of the canopy. I'm going to put glue on the front of the canopy and on the sides of the hatch plate. Now another thing you want to do is to take a little bit of masking tape and put it on the sides of the fuselage mold right below the hatch plate, so that if any of the glue that you put on the hatch plate does leak down onto the fuselage mold, it doesn't, one, stick to the fuselage mold and make a big mess, and two, it shouldn't accidentally glue the hatch down onto the fuselage, which is something I actually do on this build before I thought about this trick. I'm placing little beads of glue on the leading edge of the canopy, putting it down where I previously marked with a pencil, and making sure that the edges of the canopy below line up with the edges of the hatch plate, and also that the back of the canopy sits down well against the turtle deck. Focus the pressure of your hands on holding the canopy down to the front where it meets the hatch roof, on holding the edges of the canopy against the side of the hatch plate at the back, and also making sure that the very rear end of the canopy is sitting up against the turtle deck, taking the shape of the turtle deck. The last thing we're going to do with the poster board is the wing fairings. Now, you don't have to mold these if you don't want to. You can go ahead and just glue them against the top of the wing at the trailing edge, just like that. But if you want to give it a more realistic look, you can come back and use the very tips of your fingers, or the ruler like we did before, to establish a nice inverted curve, like you see on the real airplane. This piece is very tiny, so if you see that you're having too much of a hard time, you can just glue the piece down planar without any molding, and it should still look very reasonable and scale. I'm going to focus glue on the two linear edges up top right here and on the bottom. Now there's not much real estate, especially towards the front, so try to be a little bit economical with the glue that you put down, or you might see that you're going to be scraping off plenty of glue, and maybe even leaving some on the wing, which is not a very good idea. I'm just using my fingers to press the fairing into place, making sure that it provides a smooth transition between the wing and the side of the fuselage. And now let's repeat the exact same process on the other side. And this is the part of the build where things start really popping and it starts looking like the real airplane, and everybody's excited. These pieces being so small is one of the things that makes this build a little bit annoying and difficult for someone who's really never built a warbird before, especially in this size class, the 25-inch class. So I don't recommend this as a first warbird. You should definitely build something like the Mighty Mini Mustang, or one of the other community builds like Nate Griffin's old P39, or my Mini P40. And we're on the home stretch of the build. Now, if you'd like to install landing gear on your airplane, there are these optional poster board pieces called the wheel legs that you can attach. For instructions on how to bend and install the landing gear wire, please refer to the build video of the Flight Test Mustang linked below. I would recommend using 1.75-inch diameter wheels for this build. One little extra trinket that you can add is the armament up front that's going to be sitting on top of the hatch roof. I'll provide the dimensions for the paper and for the barbecue skewer size you'll need, so look for those on the video. What you're going to do is you're going to start off with 2 pieces of barbecue skewer, and then you're going to cut out a strip of paper with the following width, make it about 4 to 5 inches long, tape one end of the paper to the barbecue skewer so that you can start rolling it without the paper slipping off or the roll becoming too loose. And using the barbecue skewer, start gently rolling the paper over the skewer. And continue rolling until you see that the thickness of the roll is about twice the diameter of the barbecue skewer. Leaving about 1/4 inch, I'm going to cut off the excess paper. And I'm going to choose to use stick glue rather than hot glue because the paper is so thin. By the way, yeah, I'm using printer paper. I forgot to mention that. This is not Posterboard. I couldn't possibly roll Posterboard with this tight of a radius. In addition to the stick glue, I'm also going to use a little bit of tape to finish off the roll and make sure that it stays tightly wrapped around the barbecue skewer. The next thing I'm going to do is come in with a Sharpie and highlighter to make sure that this piece looks nice and scale. And I'm going to glue this down onto the hatch roof, right on those two edges, such that the barbecue skewer is what leaks over the front edge. What I like to do is put the bead of glue at the same place where I put the tape, so that I can hide the tape on the build and make sure that it doesn't get in the way of paint, and also so that it doesn't mess up the look of the plane in general. And let's repeat the exact same process on the other side. One trick you can do is also roll the paper a little bit obliquely so that the roll actually tapers in towards the front. But these are all extremely fine details that you don't have to worry about if you don't want to. So now I'm done gluing the armament onto the hatch roof. And now, when we put the hatch back on the fuselage, the barbecue skewer should be sitting over the top of the cowling, nice and scale. And that brings the assembly of our Focke-Wulf 190 to an end. Let's quickly cover the electronics since that wasn't really addressed during the build. This plane performs best with motors between the 1806 and the 2204 to 2205 class of motors. I like using a 6-inch prop for good vertical power. With regards to servos, I'd keep it under 7 gram, preferably 5 gram all around for the ailerons, the elevator, and the rudder. The inside of the fuselage is going to be rather packed, so I'd encourage you to pre-plan what electronics you're going to use. I've chosen not to include a rudder servo, but if you're using 5 gram servos all around, you should be able to tuck the servos away in the back without any problems. I'm using a very small 4-channel receiver. I've pushed the ESC into the cowling, pressing it up against one side of the fuselage box, and all the motor wires are tucked in underneath the power pod right there. The ideal battery for this build would be something like a 3-cell 800 to 1000 or a 4-cell 600 to 800. Do your best to plan the interior of the fuselage such that you can install and remove a battery at the field without having to press too many wires out of the way and then jam the hatch shut, because that's one of the things that makes these builds incredibly annoying and hard to service. A good place to start for the center of gravity is about 1 1/4 inches from the leading edge of the root of the wing. It's always good to err on the nose-heavy side for your maiden, as Josh Bixler always says. Check for ample deflection on all your control surfaces, and make sure that the propeller isn't running into the cowling when you spin it up. And you're ready to go out and fly. Now this plane is a very fast and nimble airframe, but it does have the capability of breaking into a good glide if it's balanced properly. You'll notice right off the bat that it likes its rolls and long lines and loops and implement turns.
Oh, I got that pretty good.
All of this footage that you're seeing now is on 3-cell with the Flight Test F-Pack. And now, here's some 4-cell action.
That was complete dead stick.
Thank you very much for taking the time to check out this Mini Focke-Wulf 190. If you choose to build it, I really hope that you enjoy the cutting process, the building process, as well as the flight characteristics. If there's anything you'd like to share or any feedback that you'd like to give, I'd love to hear about it on the Flight Test forums or on the Flight Test fans Facebook page. So go out there and make a memory.